But this idea that anxiety is by itself a disorder as opposed to just a symptom, that lack of attention and focus is due to a biologic problem in the brain that, oh, we just so happen to have the fix or the treatment, which is not at all a disease modifying cure. It
Yeah.
masks the symptoms while it's in the person's system. And then when it goes away, the symptoms are no longer treated and arguably, I would say, would get worse in the long term. Or, put more simply,
If you need help like this guy, call your own doctor.
all right, so welcome Roman Wyden today to Renegade Psych. Roman reached out to me a few weeks ago, and we shared a lot of similar philosophies on, well, a lot of things, but in particular on ADHD. And my understanding is that you have a history in filmmaking, producing, directing, relationship coaching, as a recording artist, a writer, and now as a podcast host of the podcast ADHD is Over.
That's correct. Yeah. Thank you. I'm going to call you for at least one time Dr. Ethan Short. You're a psychiatrist. You're somebody who is a renegade, truly. You've become disillusioned in this business of yours. And I think that's what resonated with me when I read about you, heard about you. I was like, oh, this is someone in my camp. I got to reach out. So I'm glad we are connected here today, and we can sort of deep dive into all these corners of mental health and well-being and who knows what, right?
Absolutely. And I've got to warn you, sometimes when I sit down, for example, with people on the left side of the political aisle, they'll view me as very right wing. And when I sit down with the people on the right side of the political aisle, they'll view me as very left wing. When I sit down with people who buy every bit of textbook information that they're taught in medical school about some of these things, I tend to look like a conspiracy theorist because some of the conclusions that are drawn or come to don't make common sense to me, or there are very obvious reasons why things just aren't adding up to those conclusions. And we can dive into that later. But vice versa, sometimes I talk to people who say there's no role, for example, stimulants in ADHD, or there's no role for any psychiatric medication. They don't work at all. And that to me is swinging that pendulum too far. So I tend to find myself being contrarian, and it's not as a diss or a disrespect to anybody. It's just how my brain works. As people tell me things, I want to get more information and challenge ideas, even if I agree with them 95%.
That's great. I love that you said the word common sense because I often feel the same way. Like, there's science, there's medicine, there's even like spirituality, psychology, there's all these fields. And in essence, I think they all share this one thing in common, which is common sense or logic. And I feel that whenever somebody throws it all out the window for the sake of something they've been taught or something they've been brainwashed with, that's when I kind of, like you, that's when I go from left to right to center to wherever. I'm like, look, guys, it's not making sense. And maybe I can just throw one out there that I thought of when I was getting back to my office and looking forward to this talk together was this idea when people say, like, in my book, ADHD is Over, hits someone's hands and they read the title. And if they're very convinced that it's a disorder, they will say, like, well, so you're saying ADHD is not real. And so my first question, it has to be, well, we got to talk about what does that mean to you that it's real? Which part is real and what does that mean, right? And so that's when we can kind of start engaging, I think, constructively. But most people, they look at me funny then and go like, oh, I get it. You're like, yeah, whatever, conspiracy theorist. Yeah, it is real. I believe it's real. And they walk away, right? But I think where I start is there, where I go like, what does it mean? So maybe I can ask you as a psychiatrist, what would you tell somebody that said, well, Dr. Short, what do you mean? Like, is it real? Is ADHD real?
I absolutely believe that ADHD is a real neurobiologic phenomenon. Now, the extrapolations that are taken from that is where things go a little too far. This idea that if you've got disordered dopamine transmission to the frontal lobe or disordered dopamine receptors in the frontal lobe, that's going to exist forever. You see that in typical development that males are behind females in that category. And who gets diagnosed with especially hyperactive ADHD more often? The males do, by I believe it's almost a 2-to-1 clip. And then, well, how do you know you have impaired dopamine transmission to your frontal lobe? Because we're not testing kids for impaired transmission of dopamine to their frontal lobe. We're not testing adults for that. We're just assuming that based on clusters of symptoms that are very, very common. I mean, anybody could walk into my office, and if we just went by the DSM's definition of what a diagnosis is, I could diagnose you with something.
Yeah.
You've got this whole, excuse my French, but bullshit about generalized anxiety disorder, convincing everybody that anxiety, which is a 100% natural, normal phenomenon for us humans to experience, that now it is disordered. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying there are no disordered versions of anxiety. When it gets to a certain level, I tend to call it panic disorder or OCD. And again, labels can be useful, but you can't be, cement block tied to them. But this idea that anxiety is by itself a disorder as opposed to just a symptom, that lack of attention and focus is due to a biologic problem in the brain that, oh, we just so happen to have the fix or the treatment, which is not at all a disease modifying cure. It masks the symptoms while it's in the person's system. And then when it goes away, the symptoms are no longer treated and arguably, I would say, would get worse in the long term. So, are there individuals that have neurobiologic impaired transmission of dopamine to their frontal lobe and significantly benefit from particularly stimulant treatments? Methylphenidate, I think, is way safer and just as effective as amphetamines. And we can talk about that a little bit more in the future. Yeah, absolutely. Is that idea being manipulated by pharmaceutical industry and people who have interests in profiting off of Americans' disabilities or disorders? Absolutely. And so that's where the common sense comes in, where, the first question, is ADHD real? Yeah, I think so. Is it overdiagnosed? Absolutely. Do we have any actual way of testing it other than looking at clusters of symptoms? No, we don't. And are we doing things like the rest of the developed world in this area? Or are we treating ADHD at 100 times the rate of the rest of the world combined? So, yeah, it's not to me a matter of is it real or not. It's a matter of that jump from it being a real phenomenon in a small percentage to it being there forever in everybody.
That's great. Thanks for elaborating on that. What I'm hearing is a very similar take, which is that the struggle is real, right? The behaviors, we call them symptoms, but the observed behaviors that we see that cause friction between an individual and their environment, that's real. That's happening. Unless someone's lying and they're saying, oh, you can't do, but that's real. The neurobiology, the wiring of the brain is caused by, let's just say it could be trauma, it could be environment, it could be, I'll even go as far as saying it could be vaccines for someone, right? We don't know. We can't ever really pinpoint it to one thing. But let's just say stressors on the brain or in the environment causes certain wiring. That's real too. And then that wiring might be making somebody, have less of these chemicals being transported. And like you said, we can't test that. We have a theory that that's what's happening. But the bottom line is really that, like you said, it's not a life sentence. It's not something that can't be changed. The brain can be rewired into old age. Everybody knows that. You can look that up. That's old news. But parents are told again and again that, maybe not in so many words, but what they hear is like, oh, it's a lifelong symptom management. That's why we take these medications for years and years and years and years. Here's my problem is, and it's kind of like, I do believe also that medications are beneficial if they're used as a crutch. For example, if you break your leg, you leave your cast on while the part of the body that needs the rewiring and healing is doing that thing, and then you take the cast off. But in the case of lots of parents, they will leave the cast, meaning the medication, in the child's life for, I think, way longer than it should be. And also, they're not doing the other work, the deeper work of looking into how come my child is behaving a certain way that we then call a symptom and then call a disorder, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would add to that a couple of things. One is, what is the role of our society today? There's so many disordered aspects of society, like you mentioned. Is this some sort of output or consequence of all of these drivers of inflammation, from how sedentary we are compared to how we used to be, to all of the high fructose corn syrup, all the sugar that drives inflammation that we've been told for decades is safer than fat, which I think that's becoming inarguable, that this high carb, high sugar diet is not influencing our mental health. But beyond that, what's the role of information overload? I follow a theory of mind called relational frame theory, and it revolves around language and how basically every experience that we have, including this conversation, gets imprinted on our brain. And our brain takes that information, our mind maybe is the better way, this limbic system or this interior part of our brain, and it kind of ping pongs off of all these different areas and spits out outputs to our frontal lobe of all the different things that may affect our survival. And that could be things that I need to avoid, like getting on a submersible and going down to the bottom of the ocean to view the Titanic, which has nothing to do with my life, but I'm forced into having that automatic thought because I'm aware of what I saw in the news. And the other list is everything that I should be doing that I'm not doing that would improve my potential for survival, which again, consciously, I realize that I can't do everything. I don't have endless time, energy, and effort. But my limbic system doesn't know that. And so it takes information, it adds typically emotional attachment to that, and then it gets projected to me, right? To Ethan in my frontal lobe that gets to make the final decision. So we're living in a world where we are experiencing an exponential increase in the amount of inputs that is driving more and more outputs. So is this really an issue of dopamine transmission in the brain, or is it an issue of absolute information overload that common sense, Ickley, means that you're going to be more distracted and it's going to be more difficult to stay attentive or focused on any one given thing?
Absolutely. I like that you spelled that out that way because I do believe that obviously there's this scientific or medicine kind of theory that the brain develops in relationship to the environment, right? The environment influences the brain and then the brain develops. So it would make sense that if we're living in a world where it's fast and loud and it's overloaded and it's unhealthy and there's so many stressors to the system that the brain would wire in a certain way that would reflect that, right? And then we see that. I don't think we really see it with scans and, these are composites, but we look at that and go, oh, see, that person, that human, that brain is actually not normal. And I love this line of one of the guys I interviewed, Dr. Thomas Armstrong, who said, show me a normal brain. Where is it? Is it somewhere in a museum? Like, how do we measure against that?
Stephen Hayes, who is the creator of relational frame theory and acceptance and commitment therapy, he's a big biostatistician. He has determined that there are roughly 4 normal people in the world. When you look at like 5 different metrics.
I don't think you and I are that. I think we're renegade.
No, definitely not. But the number of patients that I see that want to be normal or insinuate they want to be normal, AKA insinuating that they are inherently broken and need to be fixed, it's pretty astounding. What I try to educate as many people as I can on, and this is not a universal concept, but I truly do believe it, and I think there's a lot of evidence behind it. I have this like yin yang theory of mental disorders, that good and bad are enmeshed, within each other. You can't have just your good characteristics without bad characteristics. We're human beings. We've always evolutionarily been programmed to exist in groups where your strengths build my weaknesses and vice versa. So when you talk about things like bipolar disorder, bipolarity, there's an incredible imaginative, creative component to that. There is a benefit to having some characteristics of bipolar. Now, the increased risk of suicide is certainly not a benefit. That's a weakness or a detriment to having that condition. But, Kay Jamison, a famous psychologist with bipolar, did a study on the poet laureates in England, found that despite bipolar being 1 to 2% of, prevalence in the population, that in the poet laureate population, it was like 40%. You see elite athletes all the time having past that could be labeled as traumatic, childhood trauma that creates at the same time creates a drive within them to want to live up to some ideal and so motivated to put work into it. People who are depressed tend to be more skeptical, especially in their depressed state. When you're sitting in the back of the cave and somebody comes around trying to sell you snake oil from a neighboring tribe, well, the happy-go-lucky person might bite on it. But the depressed person that's more skeptical in the back of the cave and tends to have a higher intellect is going to say, I don't know about that. That doesn't seem right. So this idea that you have this disorder and need to be fixed, as a society, we've got to get away from that.
Yeah.
Certainly there are people, you have a traumatic brain injury, you get hit by a car and you have part of your frontal lobe that has to be dissected or cut out because it's so damaged. There's not much benefit to that.
Yeah.
There are certain conditions, terrible genetic conditions people are born with, not a lot of benefit to that. But for the most part, we've all got to realize that there are strengths on the other side of the weaknesses that, again, we have built-in minds that focus on the problems or the weaknesses.
Yeah.
I just always like to plug that kind of yin yang for patients to understand you're not broken, but you're also not meant to be isolated by yourself all the time. You're supposed to be in a diverse group where you all build upon each other.
Yeah, I love that. And I really hope that there will be or are more psychiatrists or psychologists like you out there, because I think we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I tell parents that all the time. This is not about teachers are bad, schools are bad, psychiatrists are bad, medications are bad. No, we've just sort of started leaning on them and not trusting our own intuition, doing our own research and questioning certain medications and realizing medications for ADHD are not safe and effective. They're safe for some people, they're unsafe for many, and they're not as effective as we've been told, So, but do the research so then you know what that means. And when they say they're safe and effective, then you can make an informed decision, right? But I feel like what you just said brought up this idea of, like, I had a friend who had an ex-wife that was extremely OCD. I've never heard anything like that. I mean, he lived like in a prison. It was so clear to me when he explained it. I said, look, I'm not a psychiatrist, but OCD to me, it's like your life was out of control as a kid, and now you try to control as much as you can. It makes you feel safe. That's it. To me, there's no other, call it a disorder, call it a whatever. Yes, it's a psychological, that person's psyche is not ordered in a way such that they can create harmony in their environment. Yes, that part is out of order, but it's not broken. It's not wrong. It's not a psychiatric, disorder the way we know them, but we still treat it like that. I mean, what's it going to take for us? What do you think as a psychiatrist, as somebody who's in it? What do you think it would take, for example, and this is my fantasy, is to get ADHD out of the DSM, just like we got eventually homosexuality out of it. We're changing names. We're like, do you think it's ever possible to get a disorder removed from the DSM?
I don't know. I really don't know. I would add to what you just said that I do think that these mental disorders can exist without trauma. I think mostly there is environmental trigger on genetic predisposition, but I think there's mounting evidence over the last couple of decades that our traumas get passed to our children. So in that way, like, trauma may be necessary, but it may not be necessary for each individual as long as it occurs in the individual's genetic history. In terms of getting things out of the DSM, it just seems to get bigger and bigger. I mean, it just seems to be more and more influenced by marketing forces as opposed to what actual good science says.
Yeah.
It's just too big of a market to think that we can get rid of ADHD as a diagnosis.
Yeah.
Hopefully, we can shift our perception on what it is and what actually needs to be treated versus, and again, treated with medication. Like anybody with symptoms of ADHD, I would encourage them to get some form of treatment, just like anybody with any thing they want to be labeled as a disorder or not disordered. Like we can all optimize our lives by understanding how our minds work, how our experiences frame the way that our minds automatically react to current experiences. So it's not about not treating in some form or fashion. I think what you and I are on the same page about is that we are over treating the crap in terms of medications. And we need to rely on understanding what these symptoms mean in the grander context, understanding that that ADHD brain, maybe that would have been a better person to sit outside of the cave and be on watch because they would notice a bunch of different things happening in their environment. They may not be able to key in as well on any one given, you know, situation, but there are benefits to all of these things. So
Yeah.
I don't envision anything coming out of the DSM, or if it does, like homosexuality, it will be replaced with things like gender dysphoria and
Some version.
disruptive mood dysregulation, disorder, you know,
Yeah.
all
Yeah.
of these things. It'll be replaced. So I'm just not, unless we just totally overhaul and go away from the DSM. I think a very promising way of actually diagnosing mental health conditions would be via functional MRI scans that look at how the brain is connected to itself. But that may also never happen because then you've got a way to actually diagnose people on a brain image. And that's going to reduce diagnoses rates across the board, I think.
Exactly. It
So
would.
it'll never. So again, I'm being a little bit down on the question, but
The realist, you know? You got
yes,
to be.
yes,
You got to be.
realist. I'm really curious if you could weave us briefly through your life history from, you know, what do you want to be when you grow up phase of life to ADHD is over podcast.
Wow. What do you want to grow? What do you
I
want to
mean,
be when you
you've
grow up?
literally like I
Yeah.
was looking you up
Uh,
and there's just so many different
Yeah.
things that you've done and that you've had your hands in. So I'm curious a little bit, you know, without hearing every year, you know, month by month, but a little bit about your personal history.
Yeah, thanks for asking. I'll keep it as short as I can. And, you know, if you've ever heard of the term jack of all trades, it was based on me. And I grew up in Switzerland, which is where we invented OCD, just saying. But anyway, I was super into sports when I was a kid and music, was a DJ. And then I went to work for Club Med. That got me out of Switzerland. And I loved traveling and being with, you know, foreign people and spinning records at the time and entertaining, and you know I was in my element. And then I was like, I want to be an actor, I'm going to go to Hollywood, which was so naive, but thank God I didn't even question it. I just left. I sold everything and left. Came to Hollywood, started acting, and actually got some jobs. I got a print job right away, got some small, you know, roles on Melrose Place and Coach and all those older shows. And I was like, this is great. And then I, you know, acted for a while, took acting classes and some famous studios. James Franco was a classmate of mine, and just, you know, great people. And Jeff Goldblum was a teacher at one point. And so I learned a lot. And then I decided that that's not for me. I want to make content instead of be in it. So I'm not dependent on somebody saying yes or no to my looks or my talent. So I went to film school. I was being a waiter, supported myself, went to film school, got my degree in directing. And that's, you know, my directing, or call it entertainment background. That's how that came about. And then met this woman, got married, had two kids. During that time, we started a couple of companies, a design agency and a production company, and serviced like big clients like Procter and Gamble, Kimberly Clark, and Chrysler, and just learned a lot about creativity, but also learned a lot about, you know, marketing and advertising, and also a bit. I'm jumping ahead, but as part of my book, ADHD is Over, I talk about this sort of mass hypnosis or mass formation where, you know, big clients would come in and say, we make the best cars in the world. This is Chrysler. And I was like, well, I mean, I grew up in Europe. I think Mercedes, BMW, and they've got you beat, but I love your enthusiasm. And I mentioned this because that's where I learned how it's so easily done that you can have an entire group of people believe something that they call true, but really it's just an inspirational slogan and a company kind of motivator. And so that's when I woke up a bit to advertising and marketing. And I was like, I don't know if I like this field. And so then our son turned 7 at the time. This is my oldest son, Kai. And the school, the teacher and the principal said, well, you should come in. We need to talk. He's a little rambunctious. And eventually they told us, we think he has ADHD. You should get him tested, which we did. And then we got back 6 diagnoses all in one. It was like, here's your diagnoses with 5 extra ones, which was 8.
Was this all instigated by a teacher at the school?
Yeah. Yeah. It was a teacher, and the principal was fully backing up the teacher, right? This was my first interaction with ADHD. I'd heard about it. It made sense. Oh, well, the teacher in the classroom. Okay. Well, I guess I know they're not a psychiatrist or psychologist, but they are sort of the first red flag, if you will. And I won't go into too much detail, but my gut feeling just said like, this is bullshit, to use your French from earlier. I was like, something doesn't add up. I'm going to do more research. And then from then on, I was just given books by people and read studies. And, eventually one of my mentors in my relationship coaching circle said, you should start a podcast. You got a good voice. You want to say something, like, why don't you just start a podcast? And here we are, right? Like, this is 10 years total, but like 6 years later, this is my second podcast. I did one on intimacy and relationships, which was during my relationship coaching era. It's no longer active, but learned a lot there, all connected, right? Being able to be conscious and aware and intimate with people, not just romantic intimacy, but like with friends and family and children, right? Really be connected and authentic. So that led to then my experience as a host. It was easier to start the ADHD's Over podcast. And following my son's development was kind of what do you call it? A process of elimination of like, we're not going to medicate. So what else can we do? And there was a list of, 50 things. And you go like, okay, we tried this supplement. We tried this therapy. We tried this massage and this brain neurofeedback. And, we just did it all. And I can't point my finger at what worked, but I know that our son is doing well right now. He's 17. He's doing a year of high school in Ecuador with his mom right now. He had 2 restaurant busser jobs before he left, made money, was like a celebrated employee, at the age of 15 and a half. He's no longer really hyperactive or impulsive, as his younger brother confirmed the other day. He's like, wow, Kai's really changed, And he is just a really intelligent, very strong-willed young man. And I'm so proud of him and us that we decided not to medicate. Again, nothing against medication. It just wasn't our thing. It wasn't our path. So I started interviewing people on this podcast, and here we are. I'm so glad to get this opportunity to talk with you about it. You're an expert in the field. I'm an expert in my son, and certainly have talked to a lot of experts, but the loop closes here, right? Where I have somebody who's also interested in having an open-minded, constructive discussion around the alternatives and give that as much weight as we give to the mainstream narrative. So thank you for that.
So you mean to tell me that your son, who you decided to forgo treatment medication wise for ADHD, is not a homeless drug addict now?
No. Thank you for saying that, because that's what we were promised.
And I should clarify, I hate the term addict, so I shouldn't have said it, but
delinquent.
Yes, it was for shock value
Yes.
more than anything.
But that's what parents are told. You're right. Absolutely
right. So I'm curious, what were you told? Because it's a scary place to be when you're getting so much information thrown at you about how dangerous it is to not treat this thing, and all of the implications for substance use and other mental health disorders, or just, never, taking off and leaving the nest. What were you told, and how did you resist, I guess, the fear that maybe I'm not doing the right thing by not medicating?
That's a great question. And I did leave that out, and I thank you for that. And it's pretty much what you said. I mean, we were told by the principal, who is also the owner of the school. And he was this kind of older, kind of Santa Clausy, wise guy, very calm. And I had respect for him, up until then. Well, I should say I still do, but he looked at us and he said, if you don't medicate him now, not only is he not going to get the benefits of this great school, but also is he going to most likely self-medicate later and potentially become a drug addict, and some of them end in jail, right? So it's not like he's going to end in jail, but the way he laid it out was enough of what I call like guilt mongering, where you're like, oh shit. And one thing I will just say to anybody listening now, if you're in that situation, my book was originally going to be called ADHD is Not an Emergency, because it's not. And so what I'm looking back, what I realize is that in that moment, we could have been like, okay, well, thanks for that reflection. We're going to think about it. There's no rush. We're just going to take a few months and, but we couldn't because they said, well, you can't stay at the school because it's too much, So we had to change schools. But if you can, as a parent, if you're allowed to, if you have that flexibility or space, I would again say it's not an emergency. Your son isn't going to fail in life if you don't start medicating him or start treatment today or tomorrow or next week, right? Take some time off, like let it resonate, see what resonates and what doesn't. Talk to people, take a deep breath, go on a vacation, do something, like let it sit for a bit, right?
Go away from it consciously. Let your subconscious kind of toil over it. There's no rush to make that. It's a big decision. And when you feel rushed into making a big decision like that, that's generally where people start to make mistakes. It's so obvious to me that we're over medicating the absolute shit out of our kids. And to be honest, if somebody tells me that I should medicate my 5-year-old because they're hyperactive, it's going to be hard to hold my tongue. I mean, it's just a ridiculous phenomenon. And one of the things that bothers me to the core is that we don't ever hear about how other countries are dealing with the same problem.
Disclaimer. This podcast is for informational purposes only. The information provided in this podcast and related materials are meant only to educate. This information is not intended as a substitute for professional medical advice. While I am a medical doctor and many of my guests have extensive medical training and experience, nothing stated in this podcast nor materials related to this podcast, including recommended websites, texts, graphics, images, or any other materials, should be treated as a substitute for professional, medical, or psychological advice, diagnosis, or treatment. All listeners should consult with a medical professional, licensed mental health provider, or other healthcare provider if seeking medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment.
Or, put more simply,
If you need help like this guy, call your own doctor.
Thanks again for watching and or listening. If you're passionate about the subjects that I discuss on the channel, do me a favor and like, comment, subscribe, do whatever you can to make your voice heard, that these are problems that must be addressed in our society. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, I want to hear them. Feel free to reach out on social media or email us at renegadepsych@gmail.com. And if you'd like to be a guest of the show, or you have a connection to somebody that you think would be a good guest, let us know. Thanks again for listening.